If you play fantasy hockey, you're in the right place. I'm the fantasy hockey expert, and today we're going to be breaking down the Anaheim Ducks and their fantasy hockey team for 2025 to 2026. This is the beginning of our 32 and 32 hockey series, where we start with the Anaheim Ducks and we end off with the Winnipeg Jets in about 32 days from now. So stay tuned. Tomorrow we're going to be doing the Boston Bruins, which is my favorite team. And let's get started. I'm the fantasy hockey expert, and if you haven't subscribed already, go ahead. Now, this might be controversial, but the Anaheim Ducks might be the sneakiest team for 2025 to 26. Let me explain why. You have a team that hasn't made the NHL playoffs in about 7 years, with a brand new coach in Joel Quenneville, and probably one of the most young rosters in the NHL. So let's get into why this team is so sneaky for fantasy hockey. First of all, you want to look for guys that are getting you multi-category coverage when you're looking at fantasy hockey. And those names change every year. You have guys in the NHL like Fabian Zetterlund, who last year outperformed his ADP by about 20 draft picks. So he's a guy who's currently on the Ottawa Senators. I'm going to give you a comparison on the Anaheim Ducks in Chris Kreider. So Kreider is a former 50-goal scorer, if you didn't know. He's going to be playing second-line minutes on this team with a lot of talent around him, whether that's Leo Carlsson, possibly Cutter Gauthier. There are so many line combinations. Probably Mason McTavish is the guy who's going to be playing with Chris Kreider, a guy who, again, so much on-top potential. We'll go into his fantasy value as well. But what I'm trying to say here is you have a roster of so many guys who not only are deep sleepers, but guys who you can stream on a nightly basis. And that's why I think this team has so much fantasy value. The reason I think that the Anaheim Ducks might be the sneakiest team this year in fantasy hockey isn't because they could possibly make the playoffs, but it's because I have two of my top 5 sleepers on the Anaheim Ducks. I'm going to be going into which two those are. I'm sure you're wondering whether they're a defenseman, maybe a left winger or center. We're going to be starting off with Cutter Gauthier. He is one of my top 5 sleepers for fantasy hockey this year, and I'll tell you why. So Cutter Gauthier had 20 goals last year. He had a brutal start to the season. He had about 2 goals in his first 25 games. So he was on pace for about 12 goal year. He really picked up the pace. He had power play one time. We also saw him throw the body a little bit too, which I was really surprised about. Not only this, but he is locked in on that first power play. He looks like he's the shooter outside of Leo Carlsson. And not to mention the hiring of Joel Quenneville is going to mean Gauthier has to show what he's made of after being traded a few years ago to the Anaheim Ducks. I look at this roster from top to bottom and I see so many streamable options. I'm not talking about guys who you're going to have on your team the whole year, but I'm talking about guys like Chris Kreider, Frank Vatrano, Ryan Strome, even a guy like Olin Zellweger, who I think could be the possible PP1 guy for a little while on this Ducks team. Next up, you have a big question mark in Mason McTavish, who is currently an RFA. He's probably the biggest stud who hasn't signed his deal yet. You have guys like Marco Rossi who have signed. You have guys like Mitch Marner who have found homes. But with McTavish, it's a little interesting to see how much money he's going to get. But undoubtedly, he still has to prove himself to his new coach in Joel Quenneville. Quenneville comes with a lot of experience, and I think this is going to make McTavish try and secure a top 6 role. He played a lot of third-line minutes last year, which did hurt his production, but undoubtedly I still think Mason McTavish has that crazy ceiling, possible 90-point ceiling, even more. We saw what he did in the OHL for the Hamilton Bulldogs, and I think he can do much more in the NHL. Looking into the top 3 players on the Ducks, I'm going to mention Lukas Dostal as my 3rd best player on the Ducks. And here's why. I think Dostal could get a possible 55 starts. You don't really have any real backup option for the Ducks. I just don't see any competition for Dostal. I think it could hurt Dostal to not be playing against some of these weak/mediocre teams in Seattle, San Jose. A lot of these West teams, I think, could really go to the backup option. That being said, Dostal's proved himself. He's kind of just been shadowed by John Gibson for the last few years. So what does this mean? It means you're going to see more shots going towards Dostal, more opportunity. Again, a guy who has to prove himself to goalie coaches as well as Joel Quenneville, and just a whole new team in front of him, which I think means everyone's going to believe in him. Everyone's going to give him a shot. You will see some high-scoring games, but again, that shot volume, Dostal was the #1 goalie in goals saved above expected last year, so that's something really to note. Credits to moneypuck.com for that stat. Let's go into my #2 player in Cutter Gauthier. I think Cutter Gauthier could go for about 30 goals 25 assists for 55 points this year. While that's nothing crazy, I do think that is considered a breakout year for Cutter Gauthier. I think last year having 20 goals was pretty ecstatic for him after his pretty slow start to the season. I think he had 3 goals in his first 27 games before breaking out in January. The reason I have Cutter Gauthier above a guy like Dostal, just because of his opportunity in every single game to produce, whether that's on the power play, just being on the first line with Leo Carlsson and Alex Killorn. I think this guy's going to shoot the puck. We saw what he did in the World Juniors. He's an absolute stud. And yeah, I think this guy could really break out, possibly 35 goals, honestly. So let's go into our number 1 player, and that is Jackson LaCombe, a guy who had about 45 points last year on a horrendous Ducks team. All signs point towards him being the number 1 guy on the power play. And he's also playing top minutes with Radko Gudas. This guy had 17 points last year and then went into a 44-point campaign. I think LaCombe could go for about 65 points. I think his ADP is a little high. It is above guys like Mikhail Sergachev, who is one of my top 5 sleepers. That being said, we'll stick to the Ducks in Jackson LaCombe. You have a really young team. LaCombe's only 24 years old, and he's playing with guys like Leo Carlsson, Cutter Gauthier, so many studs who I think are going to help him on the power play. He's also a right-handed shot, so again, a guy who's just going to be shooting that puck. I think he had 14 goals last year. Very impressive for a guy like that. I think this guy could be drafted a top 20 defenseman. I wouldn't take him at his ADP of around 17 for defenseman. That being said, he's definitely the number 1 option on the Ducks in terms of fantasy value. Now let's talk banger leagues a little. So if anyone's unfamiliar with a banger league, this means players who get hits, blocks, penalty minutes, a bunch of the banger categories. Some leagues will have penalty minutes, some leagues will have plus minus, a bunch of those things. To build off the LaCombe point, Jackson LaCombe was a +0 last year. So on a brutal Ducks team going +0, pretty impressive. We're going to build off that point in our defenseman here and go on to Radko Gudas, who Gudas is a guy you might want to draft late in your leagues, because if you don't, someone probably will. He's the captain of the Ducks. He's going to be logging top minutes. Might not be on the power play ever. Might not be the guy who's in the slot about to score a goal, unless it's Florida versus Toronto a couple of years ago. But that being said, Gudas is a veteran. He doesn't step away from fights, from hits, from blocks. A guy who's definitely going to get you fantasy points every night. And alongside Jacob Trouba, who, again, was traded to the Ducks, probably 8 months ago. I don't know who saw that coming, but Jacob Trouba actually led the NHL in blocks last year. So if your league counts blocks, if the blocks are at a premium, possibly a 0.5 stat compared to goals, which might be a 1 or a 2, Jacob Trouba is a guy to look at. And overall, this team is just one of the only teams in the NHL that has that category coverage. You're also going to see that from Frank Vetrano on offense, who I might have mentioned earlier in this video. And you're also going to see the hit volume from a guy like Chris Kreider. So the reason I chose this team as that deep sleeper, although they are first alphabetically, I think it was a great team to start with. Make sure you guys follow me for more. We're going to go to the Boston Bruins tomorrow. My favorite team, David Pastrnak being the number 1 option, undoubtedly. But that being said, that's it for this video. Please subscribe, follow for more, and let me know what you want to see in the next video. Thanks, guys.